Hello, thanks for joining us for another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. It is February 25th, 2025. I'm Kathleen Newman, and this is our program on mourning jewelry. Before I introduce our speaker and we get into the content of the program, I just want to take a moment, the way we always do, to remember that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. And wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. Our speaker tonight, Sarah Nahama, she is a working metalsmith and antique jewelry collector who's based in Providence, Rhode Island. She has a degree in art history from Boston University and studied jewelry making at the century-old North Bennett Street School in Boston's North End. She also learned the ancient technique of high carat gold granulation with Cecilia Bauer in her New York City studio. In 2012, Sarah co-curated the exhibit In Death Lamented, the tradition of Anglo-American mourning jewelry at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. She authored the companion volume by the same name and was a major lender to the exposition. And since then, Sarah has lectured on the topic of mourning and sentimental jewelry at museums, historical societies, jewelry associations, and antique symposia in the US, the UK, and in Australia. And she joins us tonight to talk more about this topic. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you to everybody for joining in. I'm excited about my talk tonight. I have a lot of material to present, so things may move a bit quickly. I wanted to say that what I'm going to be talking about in relation to mourning jewelry is Western European and American mourning jewelry within the culture of Western Europe. And there are other cultures that have various mourning practices. Some include jewelry, and I am not very well versed in those, so there really won't be anything about that. So the focus here is starting with, there'll be quite a lot of things from England and then colonial America, and I will show a few examples from a few other places. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen now. So the title of my talk, Fond Remembrance to Cherish the Memory, 350 Years of Mourning Jewelry. And so basically what mourning jewelry is jewelry to commemorate somebody that has passed on. Whether it be a family member, whether it be a friend, or even a public figure. And I'll show different examples. But I first like to talk about the roots of early mourning iconography, which is in memento mori iconography and art, primarily paintings, sculptures, but there was memento mori jewelry too. Now, what memento mori means is in Latin, remember you must die. And it was a way for people to be conscious that life is brief, to live a good life, and remember that death can come at any point. And these were the types of things, well, you saw the child sleeping on the skull, the beginning of life and the end of life. We all end up that way. This is a ring, an English ring, mid-16th century, and you can see the enameled skull in the center, and then around that it says memento mori. Now, you'll see some mourning jewelry that looks very similar to this, but this is not to commemorate any particular person. It was worn, as I said, just for somebody to be conscious of life and the brevity of it and death. Of course, this was always rooted in the Christian religion. And here we have another memento mori piece. This is what's known as a ribbon slide. You can see the lugs on the sides. A ribbon would be passed through that. and it could be worn at the wrist or at the throat. And on the front, you have a skull and crossbones. And what look like tears, they can sometimes be considered tears. They've also been considered, I've seen them in other objects, as the blood drops of Christ. And then on the back, this is a French piece. On the back, it says, every moment leads us to this. So again, not mourning any particular person. I kind of like to start with the execution of King Charles I of England. He was beheaded for treason in 1649. And while he wasn't a popular ruler, he sort of became, in some circles, almost like a martyr after his execution. And jewels were made to commemorate him. Now, these were, his image was hidden. As you can see, this is a locket with a lid, and it has his portrait, and then it has a crying eye, the date of his death, and in Latin, who can control their tears? So while he was regent, there was uh, he was not very well liked, but afterwards he did become kind of this figure, and many souvenirs were made to mourn him. Now, these were expensive pieces, certainly something like this. This one a little less expensive, but still, something like this would have not been able to be afforded by most people. And you can see this is a one locket, but you see each side, the outside and the inside, each side. So you have here, I live and die in loyalty. Spelling wasn't standardized, so you have spelling that's different. And you can see the heart with the arrows pierced almost as if it's a Christian symbol of the passion and of a martyr. And inside, sure enough, it says martyr populus, the people's martyr, a medallion of Charles I, and then prepared be to follow me, CR Charles Rex. And prepared be to follow me was coming again from memento mori, to remember that we all will end up hopefully not beheaded, but dead. So that's you'll see some of these things in other mourning pieces. So this is a mourning piece. Here you can see a broadside memorial for Lydia Minot of Dorchester. And you can see, I hope it's clear enough, but at the top, some of the iconography, which is a skeleton with a scythe and grave digger tools. You can see a funeral, a coffin, an hourglass, a winged hourglass at the top, and another hourglass to be conscious of time fleeing. And this is another ribbon slide in gold, and it has a skull and crossbones. So you see, it's very much like the memento mori slide that I showed, but this is a mourning piece. And we know this by the inscription on the back, which is in Latin, and it says, Sir E.H. obit, obit, obit in Latin is died. December, it says ye, but it's pronounced the 8th, 1700. So it's mourning this particular person, who I did figure out that it was a person named Sir Edward Harley in England. And you have hair under the skull and crossbones, just laid flat, gold wire, and then green kind of foiled, probably paper. And green is very symbolic of renewal and resurgence, so that would be appropriate. Now, this is a little video. I like to show these. Oh, you'll hear the noise of my street, but this is hard to tell whether it's exactly memento mori or mourning. It does have initials on the back, but I've seen memento mori rings that were signet rings with a person's initials, so I'm not 100% sure, but I really think that this is a mourning piece. It's got the hair, and while it has these symbols of mortality, it is early enough, and it would be, they did incorporate these types of things. This is English too. Now, at funerals, um, certainly for the wealthy, souvenirs were given out to attendees, and they would be gold rings, death's head bands, they're known as, or and or scarves and gloves as souvenirs. And this is one for a member of the Faniel family who I've not been able to figure out who it is. It's a child. It is inscribed on the inside. It's a 4-month-old child with only the first initial A. And I've tried very hard to trace who it is. But this is the Faniels were a very wealthy family from Boston, merchant family, and they would have been able to provide a number. These were given out, numerous ones to various attendees, and so they would have been able to afford to provide this. And yes, you can see on the inside it says 4 months, May 1738. And you see here also a maker's mark, which is of Jacob Hurd, who was a very well-known Boston goldsmith or silversmith, really. The lines between silversmith, goldsmith, jeweler was not quite as distinct as it is today. And I'm showing another ring, also very similar, with Jacob Hurd's mark. And we find parallels in the old cemeteries. So you see here with the winged hourglass and the winged skull and then the skull and crossbones. These are both in Boston. English mourning rings of the same type were more elaborate. They were usually enameled. From what I was told by somebody who's an expert in portrait miniatures was that the Americans, certainly colonial America, and then even up until about 1789, there was not the proper kiln to do hot enameling, which is enamel that will last quite a long time. So they sometimes in America did cold enameling, but it tended to chip. And these early bands that I showed you, like for the Faniel, Death's Head ring, these were not enameled. So they just did away with that altogether. And you mostly see them in English rings of the same time period. That evolved into another type of style, which was influenced by the French, known as Rococo. So that consisted of very swirly, undulating wave type ribbon sections of rings. And here there's two rings. They're both mourning rings. One 1747 and 1765. They both have central stones. And each section has part of the dedication, the standard dedication, which would be when they died and the age they were when they died. The name, obviously, as well. So here's a video. You can get a sense of the size of it, too. These aren't really big in terms of heft. Goes all the way around with the raid back, and that's an amethyst in the center. And this is an English ring. I happened to find, because I do watch a lot of auctions, these 3 rings that came up for the Pepperell family from Maine. And we have Sir William Pepperell, who died in 1759, and you can see that style over on the left of the Rococo band. A later ring from 1798 for William Royal Pepperell. I believe that was one of his sons. And that style developed towards the turn of the century into the 19th century. And then also one for Lady Elizabeth Pepperell from 1775. And these are all in keeping with the style, the predominant style of their times. I'm just going to read this really quick because it tells about the customs. So at the funeral, select individuals often received gold mourning rings, which provided a comforting link to the departed and reminded the recipients of their own mortality and the promise of eternity. One 1768 example by Nathaniel Hurd, who was Jacob Hurd's son, also went into the same business, memorialized the demise of Falmouth merchant Alexander Ross, features a skull and wings on an otherwise plain gold band. Sir William Pepperell fulfilled the expectations of his position when he provided mourning rings for the 1751 funeral of his son, Andrew Pepperell. On the other hand, Dorcas Cutts of York, declaring herself sensible of the vanity of splendid and pompous funerals, will bet no ring should be given at her funeral, which took place in 1758. There's always somebody like that. But anyway, so you can see that it was a status thing as well as an acknowledgement of the person who passed. There were even funerals that I read about, certainly in Massachusetts, where 200 gold rings would be given out at great, great expense. This is another ring. So remember that I said these were made in multiples. So this is another of the same one that we just previously saw in the set of three, also for Sir William Pepperell in the Rococo style. This one is at the Kittery Naval and Historical Museum in Maine. And just to show that this same style was present in other types of jewelry, these are pendants, lockets. They both have hair in an eternity knot inside. The one on the left is a mourning locket, and the one on the right is a friendship locket, which says in French, "Your friendship is dear to me." So hair was actually given as a token of affection and love, sometimes in a marriage jewel, also to honor a person in the family or to keep somebody close when they traveled. It was not necessarily at all just for mourning. And now, as we get into the later part of the 18th century, you'll see some ring styles and how things get larger. This is a particular locket with a technique known as sepia work. And so that is ink of the cuttlefish mixed with pulverized hair and an adhesive, some type of adhesive, I think gum arabic was used. And so on the front, you have a portrait of the deceased, James Ferguson, and on the back, a very elaborate scene of his tomb, trees. It's a whole graveyard scene. And a motto, "He being made perfect in a short time, fulfilled a long life." And this starts to become very popular. This is an American ring for a girl that was 15 when she died. So you have white enamel. That wasn't always the case that a child or unmarried person would have white enamel, but it was often the case that it would be a symbol of purity and white would be used instead of black. And then these are garnets surrounding the hair work. And you see predominantly an urn and a weeping willow. These are two very ubiquitous symbols that were, I think, the most common in the sepia and watercolor mourning miniatures. The reason for that is that the urn, although people weren't being cremated, but the urn stood in for the physical remains in the body. So you see here a woman cradling and weeping over an urn. And it happens that this was her child who died. The hair is on the back, hidden, so it'd be worn next to her skin. And again, white enamel. You also do see the skull and crossbones, which is a little bit late for this ring, but styles were fluid and there were anachronisms and there were things that people wanted, and perhaps they wanted this. Again, just to show you that hair was not necessarily for mourning alone. This would have been a love token, especially with the red rubies and the beautifully woven hair work. And here we have beautiful mourning ring with a sepia urn, and it says most worthy of remembrance. And you can see kind of the straight band, but it's starting to taper up at the shoulders just a little bit. And you see the round face of the ring. These will get larger to accommodate more elaborate scenes. And here are two examples, two different shapes. The one on the right, the marquee or navette shape, was a very popular one. And you can see it can fit quite a bit of information. The motto is there. And then the woman grieving at the tomb with the urn, which is quite predominant. And she's also holding an anchor, which is a symbol of hope. Now, the women that are shown are generally, perhaps the one on the left not, but definitely the one on the right, are generally idealized images of women. They don't represent a particular person. They are the embodiment of grief, familial grief, and take their roots from, this was the time when neoclassicism was very popular, and they took their roots from Greek mythology, particularly the myth of Andromache mourning Hector, and also Niobe, who was mourning multiple children. So you get this kind of idealized, and again, you can see this in cemetery art, this idealized female mourner. Later on, into about starting about 1800, you'll see women in contemporary clothes. Here again. And these mottos, oftentimes, I mean, these would be personalized and they were expensive still, but there were samples that a person could choose from, and then they could have perhaps a motto put on, and they would have the name and everything put on the back. So it was kind of an industry, not as we know it today. Everything was hand done here, but you know, I've seen examples of many of these types with very similar scenarios, very similar motifs. This is an interesting one. This one it's American, and Mrs. Margaret, now whoever engraved it spelled her name wrong, but again, it probably didn't matter. But she was the wife of a ship captain out of Newburyport, Massachusetts. And he had died the year before at sea. And you see in the scene on the left, you see a little ship. I hope it's visible, a little ship foundering. And then you see two birds flying. And in the tree, you see two other birds in the weeping willow. And then you see the urn. Well, this was all very symbolic because the two birds that are flying away are the souls of Margaret and her husband, who had died previously. And the two birds in the tree symbolize their two children who are alive. This I bought with it. This was her son Robert's mourning brooch. He died much later in 1846. He too had become a ship captain. And it's a completely different style, as you can see. And I happened to discover later that because I also like old handwriting and I like things relating to mourning, so I had a receipt for mourning jewelry from a company in Boston, Dyer and Eddy, to a Miss Lyman of Springfield, Mass. And it turns out that Miss Lyman ended up marrying Captain Robert Emery in 1811, and they had a son, Charles, who also became a ship's captain. But I like this because you can see how much things cost and what she was getting. The handwriting's a little hard to read, but it says one gold and paste set miniature setting. Paste is leaded glass, one chain for it, hair in it, and Morocco case, which would have been leather. And so she paid $33, which today would be about $1,000. Now you get also the male mourner, less common. And when you see a male mourner, it's almost generally a particular person. So now the brooch on the left It did not have any identification, but I love the gentleman with his hat reverentially at the urn. And on the right, that's an English piece. The one on the right is American piece for Mary Wetmore from Connecticut. And this would be her husband. I like to track people down and do research, and I did find where she's buried. I found the house where they were married. So I'll just show you this little video so you get really a sense of what something like this is her tombstone. It's a little worn, but you can see. I should have said the weeping willow, which you see so much, is indicative of human grief. Although they are common cemetery trees, they figure very much, as you can see here in all of these pieces. This happens to be sepia as well as watercolor. You see the blue sky. And now here you see a woman in contemporary dress for the time and a man. And this is mourning two children, almost certainly their children, um, not lost, but gone to bliss. That was a common motto. Now, this is not a mourning piece for George Washington. This was painted before he died, but portrait miniatures were very much in vogue if you could afford it. And certainly somebody like Washington would have commissioned something and given it, perhaps to his wife or to somebody close. This was painted by John Ramage, who was, I believe, originally from Ireland and settled in New York. I think he was running from debts. I'm not 100% sure. There's a little bit of a scandal, but he was quite a good painter. And I think he also did the casework. Um, but anyway, you can see the hair with the initials. And when Washington did die, there were many, many souvenirs made because people wanted something to mourn the first president. So you get a variety of different things, anything from ceramic to textiles, as the picture on the left you can see. And again, it's very similar to the scenes that we see in jewelry, with the woman at the tomb, the urn, the weeping willow. There's a man here too. And then on the right, with the symbols of the flag, the obelisk, which is usually reserved for people of importance, and drum, kind of all these things related to the revolution. And then you get some very bespoke, I think only 5 of these were made with an enameled portrait of Washington. And you can see they're quite expensive. I know one is at the Smithsonian and one is at Mount Vernon in Virginia. I don't know. I think there's maybe a couple in private collections. Anyway, it's so you get the gamut. But you can also see the style now is changing. You do have the portrait, but you have this very plain tapered band, and that kind of became the norm around this time. Well, a little bit earlier, even 1785 or so. Again, a portrait miniature. And oh, let me see here because I can't read. This Zoom is blocking. But anyhow, this was the first governor of Maine, William. I can't read it and I forget now. But anyhow, I hope you can read it. Painted by Edward Green Malbone, who worked
It's
in.
William King, Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, William King. Great. Well, yeah, so this was he was alive when this was painted, but you see also the hair work on the back. Um, so Maine was part of Massachusetts, for those of you who don't know, and when it became independent, he became the first governor. And now we get into another style. which was around the turn of the century. And it's known in America as Federal, Regency in Great Britain, Empire style in France. And it's characterized by very clean lines, not a lot of ornamentation. And so you see the style of these mourning rings now they still have all of the information. So these are actually the ones that you see here are four for the same person. So they were still being made in multiples to give out, although funerals weren't necessarily, they weren't giving out hundreds and hundreds anymore, but they would still pass these out. And then also the pendant on the right, very clean lines, that I believe is English, very clean lines, with just the text. And again, it tells the date of death and the age doesn't say the person's name, unfortunately. This is this motto, which is unusual. It comes from Hebrews in the Bible. My father being dead, yet speaketh. Actually, the Bible verse just says, he being dead, yet speaketh. And somebody put it for their father. And then on the back, there's hair, white hair, a little bit of white hair of the father, and then darker hair, which would have been the person who wore it, presumably the child. And now we have a very tiny little brooch to mourn a boy that died. He was only, how old? 4 or 5 years old, from Boston. And things started to become a little bit more affordable now to the middle class. I did research this little fellow. His father owned a tavern and a bowling alley. So, they had some money, but they weren't extremely wealthy. But something like this would have been desired. Maybe his mother wore it. And here we have, this is also a video. Here's a piece from Maine for Elizabeth Robinson. She died quite young. And you can see this is quite a unique piece with the hair in the lover's knot, the initials of her husband, A, Archibald Robinson, and B, she was known as Betsy. In memory of Betsy Robinson, died October 1809. 28 years old, affectionate wife, mother, and friend. Very personal. Now we see this is becoming a little bit more the norm. Something like this would have been just one made, and it would have been worn by her husband. Betsy Robinson is buried here. That's not, I don't think, her grave, but that's the cemetery where she's buried. And here again, you can see the style of the turn of the century into the early 19th century, this kind of cigar band, very plain with the hair work and the initials. Again, still kind of a large face to the ring. And now it starts to change a little bit. You still get kind of that tapering, plain cigar band, but here embellished with enamel, with hair work again, and the inscription on the inside now. These are more elaborate because now the style is changing once again to what became the predominant style of the 19th century, known as Gothic Revival. And that's characterized by a lot of ornamentation. So you see the ring, these are both swivel rings, actually. So the face can change, it's on a swivel. So for instance, the one on the right, Sacred to a Beloved Father, is done in enamel. And then you can switch it over and you can wear either side next to your skin or facing out. The hair was generally worn against the skin and it's surrounded with pearls. And you see very elaborate work to the gold, both around the face of the ring and the band itself. And on the right, you have the hair underneath, but again, it swivels and you can have the front. These are a pair for the same person, again, with the pearls. Pearls often symbolize tears. And here's kind of, I'll call it more of a transition piece. You still have elements of the Regency style, very clean lines, straightforward, but you have a hint of the Gothic revival in these borders, these elaborately chased borders of the gold. This is for two sisters who died 3 weeks apart. These are their parents. This was a prominent family, the Havens of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And these were painted by Gilbert Stuart, who was quite a well sought after painter. So they had plenty of money. Their obituaries, I think a number of family members all died within a month or two. I kind of figured, well, I did figure out that the younger sister, Augusta Haven, died of what was called bilious fever, which was probably typhoid or cholera. Her older sister, Mary Cheever, who was married to a Dr. Cheever, had just given birth to her second child, and she died 2 weeks later, which was very common, very common. The child actually survived and ended up drowning when he was 9. And poor Dr. Cheever, he remarried another sister of the Haven family and had, I don't know, 4, 5 more children, and they all died. It was really, I think only one child survived to adulthood, which again could happen. It was not out of the ordinary. And this is just to show more of the Gothic revival. So you have on the left the ring with the very elaborate floral borders, but you still have kind of the enamel band. So you see how it evolved from the very plain, wide band with enamel, with all the information there. Died August 1822 at the age of 76. But here, very, very highly embellished. Now, this person, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but he was Alexander Beimer. He was a loyalist to the crown. And so he became persona non grata in Massachusetts, and they asked him to leave. He left and settled in Halifax. He did very well for himself. And I love the brooch. Here now you can really see the Gothic lettering. This says "in memory of," which became one of the most common mottos that you'll see of this time period and forward, with the hair again, and beautiful use of the little shells. Very Gothic. In fact, the one on the right is very like architecture, Gothic revival architecture. And again, it says "in memory of," excuse me. Here we go. Beautiful. This is later though, but that style kept on. This was, I think this tomb is from around 1880, perhaps. So it is later than the jewelry I've been showing. But now this is one of the pieces at the Maine Historical Society. It's a brooch for Elizabeth Wadsworth Longfellow, who was a sister of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And she was engaged to William Pitt Fessenden and died before they got married. And he commissioned this. I like the organic teardrop sort of paisley shape. And again, the pearls, beautifully done too, with some kind of graduation of the pearls. And then it may be onyx, it could be glass, might be jet, but I don't think so. And this is a lovely portrait. I don't know if you can see her brooch, but it's a Maltese cross, which was another kind of element of Gothic revival style, and also relating to, the resurgence of um, kind of more conservative Christian values. And here's a whole set. This lady is from Connecticut. I don't know who she is, but you can see she's wearing earrings with the Maltese cross and a brooch. And it just so happens that the Massachusetts Historical Society has an identical set. And these earrings are great because you can take the tops off and wear just the smaller cross during the day and then attach the rest of it for a more glamorous evening look. In the middle is a lyre, which is symbolic of elegies relating to the myth of Orpheus. So all of these things, they meant something to people, and they understood the lexicon. Now here's a portrait miniature. This may have been painted after the death of this child, and it's engraved on the back telling you who he is. But I want you to kind of pay attention to the case, because this type of case, which was used for portrait miniatures, also became popular for photographs. This is an early photograph known as a daguerreotype, which started to become commercially available around 1840 or so. And you can always tell a daguerreotype because it has a mirror surface. It's on a polished plate of silver-coated copper. And so in some angles, it will be the negative, and in some angles, it will be the positive. So the cases from portrait miniatures were adopted into housing for photos. This is another type of photograph called an ambrotype, which was done on glass, and you can see how large it is. It was probably not gold, but gold filled. So these could be large to go with these voluminous dresses that were popular in the Victorian era. And here is a piece with a tintype, which is a photograph it's actually not on tin, it's on iron, and it's in a locket that can be closed in a bracelet made of hair. And I just wanted to show, this is a whole nother topic in and of itself, but different styles of hair work. The brooch on the left is Dutch, and the other two pieces are English. The one in the middle is a wheat sheaf, which is symbolic of fruitfulness and harvest and bounty. In a marriage piece. In a mourning piece, if you see it, oftentimes it relates to the gathering of the spirit. You might see some broken, strands of the wheat to symbolize the life is over. So it can be used both ways. This particular one is a portrait miniature on the other side, and it was most certainly a love token. Pignus amoris in Latin is pledge of love. And then the one on the right, beautiful hair work with flowers, and you have this beautiful opaline glass, and it is again a portrait miniature on the front, not a mourning piece. Other types of hair work that were popular were for familial wreaths, or wreaths made of hair of various peoples in a family, sometimes close friends. And these particular flowers were done with wire work. So the hair was turned around pieces of wire, and it could be bent into these shapes. And here, this woman, Maria, included kind of a little diagram, or not a diagram, but a legend, let's say, with identifying whose hair was whose. And so it included two of her brothers who had died in the Civil War. So we'll see this again in a bracelet that I'll be showing. Now, Prince Albert died in 1861, a bit suddenly, and Queen Victoria went into mourning for the remainder of her life. which was another 40 years. Many jewels were made to commemorate him, very bespoke ones like the one you see here from the Royal Collection Trust with his photograph and their intertwined initials, A and V. And then more humble ones that anybody could buy in brass with his photograph again. So people wanted these things. Think even, I don't know if you saw any, but when Elizabeth II died, there were pins available with her image. So, people still want these tokens, I think. Now, this was one that Victoria gave to Countess of Gainsborough. She was a very sentimental person. She even had memorials made for her dogs. People did mourn their pets, and she certainly did. So this dress studs that she gifted to somebody with images of her favorite dogs, and then a memorial with her dog Sharp's fur. Shortly after, 4 years after Albert died, we have the Civil War in America. A lot of loss, a lot of need for mourning pieces. These are actually not mourning pieces. These are photographic jewels. The one on the left is a pin. The one on the right was an old tintype of a Civil War soldier that I made into a ring for somebody. And here's a piece for Captain William Simpkins. He joined initially the Massachusetts 44th Regiment, and then he joined the famous 54th Regiment, the all-black regiment under Colonel Shaw. And they both died at Fort Wagner. You can see, I had to do a little repair. This belongs to the Mass Historical Society, but I did a small repair for them. And you can see the nice gold work. You have a belt buckle. Belts and garters were known symbols of eternity, just like a ring, an everlasting circle, or a snake with a tail in its mouth. And also the Greek key in black enamel also relates to eternity, the river meander that flows endlessly, and then his hair on the back. And it's engraved. There's his photo. And I had mentioned hair of living and deceased. So this is a bracelet for the Darracott family of Boston, and it has the hair of every family member. Some of the lockets have hair of two people. And then on the back, it says who they are. Now, some had already died, including one son that did die in the Civil War. The clasp is the parents, George and Sarah Darracott, and initially it would have their date of birth and then that they were married in 1807. After they died, it was re-engraved, not re-engraved, but an addition was put on with their date of death. And here they are. This was great. I went actually to the Historical Society and found the photo of Sarah Darracott, and I had the bracelet. It's something else really to have this with her whole family's hair and this information and then see her picture. I don't know. I like it anyway. I did quite a bit of research on the family. And this is not mine, but this is a memorial brooch for the two of them. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated and dies April 15th, 1865. Huge public mourning, private mourning with his wife, Mary Lincoln. Many souvenirs. Now, the bracelet that you see, that would not be his hair, although almost all of his hair was cut off. And locks of his hair even have sold for thousands of dollars. I wonder if, I don't know if I have that here, but anyway, you can also see a tintype mourning ribbon, very typical type of thing to wear in mourning of somebody at this time period. Yeah, Mary Lincoln, just like Victoria, stayed in mourning for the rest of her life. And both women also had lost children before their husbands died. And so they were grieving quite a bit already. I'm going to finish up now. This is just going to go quickly. This is a typical type of material known as jet, which is a fossilized wood mined primarily in Whitby, England, in Yorkshire. And it was very popular because of its black color, very popular material for use in mourning jewelry. The initials on the front, AEI, stand for amity, eternity, and infinity. It's not a person's initials. But jet was also popular not for mourning. People liked it and they wore it. Queen Victoria patronized the jet workers, so it became popular just through her use of it. Here's a necklace. This may or may not have been for mourning. A very fancy mourning piece. So you get the same motifs. You get the urn, you get the weeping willow, but here they're all in diamonds. Something more modest in golden enamel with a banded agate, hair on the back, and something very inexpensive, mass-produced brass or gilt metal. And I've seen these with different, my dear son, my dear daughter. Queen Victoria dies in 1901. And again, souvenirs were made for the public. This is a stamped out brooch, just die, stamped with a die. Japan metal is lacquered, just black lacquered metal with her photo. Some more expensive piece, perhaps made for somebody in the court or family member with diamonds, and her portrait. And there were pieces made for mourning during the First World War, but basically the industry kind of faded away. With her death, she had been in mourning for so many years. King Edward was tired of that whole thing. And there were other things too. Attitudes towards death changed. People were not necessarily dying at home, but in hospitals. Funeral homes were handling things. And so death kind of became removed, in a sense, from the family, um, to the point where people almost didn't talk about it anymore. That's changing, though, as we know, with the hospice movement and death positive movement, and also people doing reviving mourning jewelry with hair work and with using cremains in mourning pieces. So I think people want a souvenir of somebody they loved, whatever it might be. I thank you all. I'll take any questions if anybody has.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting. And we do
Oh,
indeed
good.
have some questions from the audience. Um,
Okay.
do you know why was mourning and memento jewelry so often inscribed with Latin as opposed to English?
I think it was, initially that was a language of the educated. French was too, although they used Latin for those types of inscriptions. Why? I'm not 100% sure. As we get later into the 19th century, certainly, or even, then things started to be in English or their native language. But it was just a standard way of commemorating or of putting a dedication.
Sure. Do
Yeah.
you know materials that were the portrait miniatures and the sepia mourning scenes? Do you know what they're painted on?
Yes, they were generally painted on ivory. So, for instance, this portrait, here was painted on a thin ivory sheet, and it's a watercolor. Um, and earlier ones had been on vellum. Sometimes you'll see them on paper, but generally ivory was the favored medium for these.
Mhm. Now, pieces that include paper, someone's asking, why don't we see like more deterioration or damage from moisture or just kind of the elements? Do you know why that is? We just lucky?
You certainly can. I'm not showing those. They're there though. I mean, oftentimes they'll get taken out and thrown away. But I've seen things in various states of damage, including the watercolor and sepia miniatures. I'm just happening so I can show you clearly you know, what was going on and what these pieces looked like.
Sure.
Uh, and there are pristine. I mean, these exist now out in the world. But yeah, things, I mean, people also, who knows how many things were lost as
Right.
well because of
Right.
damage and certainly with the plain, the gold death's head bands, people melted those down for the gold content. They didn't often even wear them because they were just a funeral souvenir.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, how long would you say on average someone would wear jewelry for? Is there like a particular standard or did it vary from person to person?
Yeah, those earlier ones, I mean, if they were worn, there wasn't a set time period. There was a set mourning period in the courts. And I'm not sure exactly all the details, but people had to be in mourning clothes, not necessarily jewelry. In fact, initial first stage of mourning, heavy mourning, you weren't supposed to wear any jewelry.
Right, right,
Now, then in the Victorian era, there became kind of a popular social thing for the women who could afford to stay in mourning for certain periods of time, depending on their relation to whoever died. So if it
right.
was
Like
their
a
husband,
spouse versus a child or a parent
correct,
or Mhm.
right. And men could get away with wearing a black armband for a certain period of time. Women were expected, in the first year, certainly not to even go out. Their clothes were dull black, not shiny, no jewelry. Then they could start adding in black jewelry. Later on, mauve and gray clothes with some pearls, perhaps, and some other type of jewelry. Did people 100% stick to it? Probably not. People want to be fashionable, but this was also the fashion too, and they could work with it. They could work with it. So, in terms of how long they would wear these pieces, there's a wonderful ring. Can't remember now whose it was, but it's at the Massachusetts Historical Society, earlier one with a skull under crystal. I think it was for a child. Oh, no, it was for a sister. And it's very, very worn. So you can tell that the woman that wore it, really wore it.
Mhm.
Whereas others, they'll be practically pristine because they didn't get worn.
Sure. Now, someone's asking, do we know anything about the elaborate hair work on a lot of these pieces, like who did them? And they're mentioning that elaborate braiding, like could that have come to North America from the African diaspora? Do we know if enslaved people did any of this kind of artwork? Can you speak to that at all?
I can't speak too much to it. I know that Africans that came to this country eventually did adopt some of the same things because I have seen, although not extensively, some pieces that included hair work with, say, a photo or an inscription. And I don't know I know that Black Americans did do professional hair work.
Hmm.
So some of these things were done by professionals. You could hire somebody, you could look them up in a directory and hire them to do this. As we get into the 20th century, um, or even earlier, the 19th century, mid-19th century, women started doing them at home, making hair work for, for sentimental purposes, and they would
Sure.
weave chains, watch chains for their husbands or their, father. They would have things that they could then take to a jeweler and have fitted with the caps or whatever it might be. But the professionals were whites and blacks and men and women.
Mhm. Now,
Mhm.
some folks are asking, a couple folks, do jet like any particular jet, like I know you mentioned pearls sometimes are associated with tears. Um, if something uses an amethyst, like does an amethyst have a particular meaning? Or you mentioned like the color white being associated with children. Do other colors have specific meanings? Can you talk at all about that, like symbolism, if there is any?
There is, yeah. So yes, pearls could also be a symbol of purity, but they generally were a symbol of tears, but not always, because you see them in sentimental jewelry too. Um, I had mentioned the color green in that early ribbon slide.
Mhm.
Green was a color, but you don't see this that often in the enameling. The enameling
Mhm.
tends to generally be black or white. I have seen kind of a periwinkle blue. And I've definitely seen royal blue, like a Bristol, they know it's called Bristol blue glass in England. It's a very deep royal blue. And that would be symbolic of great esteem for somebody because it was originally the color used in the French court.
Mm.
And then the English adopted it. And then it sort of fashion trickles down like that. So yes, I've seen the purple. I've seen a few kind of purplish enamel, which probably has the same royal connotations, although
Sure.
may not be for a royal person of royalty, but they were thought of very highly. So that would be the case. Um, Other stones, well, amethyst, I don't know, it may have been a personal thing because I have a similar ring to that amethyst one with an amethyst and two little diamonds on the sides. And I have seen a number of those rings in that style using amethyst. So I don't know if there was a prevalence of these gems coming from, they were often mined in Brazil, and the Portuguese had colonized Brazil. So I don't really know exactly how often they were coming, but they seem to have been fairly popular. And again, this is people like to keep up with the fashion. But in terms of mourning, it's mostly the black. So you would get
Mm.
onyx, you would get glass, even black glass, which can be known as French jet. Um, and you would get jet. And also, I don't know if you remember the Maltese cross set that I showed. It looks like onyx, but those are actually melanite garnets, which are garnets that are very, very dark. If you hold them up to the light, you'll see a tinge of red, but just looking at them, you would think they were black. So those were appropriate as well.
Now, I did share in the chat, folks, you can see more of Sarah's work and work that she admires on her Instagram accounts. SarahNahama.com is her website, and you can get copies of her book there, In Death Lamented. Do you have, I know, so someone asked, like in your collection, do you have anything? Jewelry that's associated with someone that was royal or someone who was very famous. And I'm wondering too, do you have like a particular piece that you would say is like your favorite?
That's the question I get asked all the time. Let me answer the first question. Yes, I actually do have a piece. It's a ring, and it's a mourning ring for Queen Caroline of Ansbach, who was the consort, the wife of King George II of England. And I got it sort of as a fluke. I don't know if I have time to tell a very quick
It's okay.
story. Um, it says around it, it's in Latin, so it says Carolina Regina, and then it has the date of death and the age. Now, the person that was selling, this is many years ago, somebody was selling it on eBay. And they knew it was a mourning ring, but I guess they didn't really, Americans oftentimes don't know Rex and Regina,
Yeah, sure.
right? So he made up a whole story that it was a ship named the Carolina Regina that sank, and this whole thing about it. And I knew right away what it meant. And I looked up the date. Yep, sure enough, matched Queen Caroline, wife of George the Second. And so I was able to get it. And so yes, and it actually even has some of her hair in it. So
Wow.
something like that would have been probably given to somebody in her court. It was, it's a very standard Rococo style looking ring with it's early 1737. So it was, like early in the fashion of Rococo style, with a crystal and the hair underneath. I'm happy to share it with anybody if they want pictures of it, but it's actually in my book. So yes, and then my favorite piece, I get asked that so much, and it's very hard to answer that because I have things that I like for their workmanship because I'm a jeweler and I can appreciate that. I like things for their unusual element to them. And then there's things that I've researched the people, and there's so much sentiment behind it that I love it for that. So I don't know. I
Yeah,
have,
it's hard to, yeah, I don't have
it's
a
very
favorite because how
hard.
do you choose?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank
right.
you so much, Sarah. This
Thank
was
you.
really fascinating, really interesting to see all these pieces. And we really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us tonight. Is there anything else you want to say before we close?
Just thank you very much for hosting me. And yeah, definitely follow my Instagram. You can email me. You can go to my website. You can order my book. I'll sign it for you. I ship anywhere in the world. So yeah, feel free to reach out if you have questions from something you saw, because, all of these things that I've shown, there can be subtopics, symbolism,
Yeah,
color,
for sure.
gems, hair work, and I just don't have time to delve that deep in
Absolutely. Yeah,
matter.
we got a lot of great questions and we didn't have time to
Yeah.
get to all of them, but I'm
Oh,
sure
well, feel
if
free
they
to
visit
reach
their
out to me.
website, they can reach out to you and give the
Absolutely.
information.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah.